insulation, and I started the flooring, vapor-proofing and waterproofing the floor. As you can see around, I've got all the subfloor down now. On top of our dimple mat was sealed. Subfloor is tongue and groove. I used the Advantech subflooring. This is it's got a treatment in it to keep it water resistant. So now that a floor has a vapor and damp proof barrier on the bottom and a dimple mat, then an inch thick of the formula insulation, and then on top of that the water resistant Advantech. Even if I did get a small amount of moisture up through the floor, or even a minor amount of flooding, the floor is relatively well protected for short-term small areas. But again, we've done a lot of work here to try to prevent any of that. Also, in our sump over here, we've got our main sump pump and a water-based, water-driven backup pump that we have installed, along with an alarm. And so we're relatively well protected now against water, and we'll move on. So I showed in the first video what the concept for the subfloor construction was going to be. You've seen a little bit in this video about how the flooring was done. I want to show you here just a mock-up of exactly how the floor construction was accomplished. Imagine that this bench top here, this is our poured concrete floor. Imagine that this piece of wood is our concrete wall. Okay, so we have our concrete foundation wall and floor. This is our 2-inch of XPS foam insulation up against the wall. And this is our Super Seal carpet and laminate subfloor dimple mat, which is our moisture and vapor barrier on the floor. As I mentioned in a previous video, the dimple mat is underneath our wall insulation by about an inch. So we have the insulation overlapping. And the dimple mat actually has two different sides to it. If you notice, if you can see it in the video, this side has a little bit more of a rounded end of dimples, and on the opposite side the dimples are a little bit more flattened out. Since we're going to be putting our foam on top of the dimples, I use the flat side to the top. It'll help to distribute load a little bit more evenly through the foam. And on the bottom, where we have the rounded dimples, that means we're going to have more area and space in between the dimples, which will allow for easier airflow and moisture movement underneath if and when we ever need it. When we're building our floor, you can see that we have our dimple mat, then our 1-inch thick of XPS foam. This is an R5 insulation value, and then we have our subfloor material. When I lay my first layer of dimple mat, I said how I laid it up underneath the wall insulation. When I put my next layer down, I'm going to make sure that I'm putting the correct rounded dimple side down again. That's going to set, the dimples are basically going to set into themselves. I'm overlapping by about an inch, inch and a half. And in between that, I'm laying a bead of GE silicone 2 caulking. It's a mold-free caulking that will remain flexible through the life of the caulk. So I lay a bead of that caulk in between the two layers of dimple mat. And then just to hold it together during the construction phase, I'm using some Gorilla Tape also after I lay the caulk, and running the Gorilla Tape over the two seams. This helps to hold the layers of dimple mat together, just so that while I'm walking on it and moving around through the construction phase, it's going to stay in place, keep the caulk beads in place, because we're dealing with big areas on the floor, and I want to make sure I'm not screwing up the work that I already did to begin with. After I have my layers of dimple mat down, I'm going to make sure that I'm trying to butt up the seams, and some of these pieces are also going to have tongue and groove in them. I'm going to use the tongue and groove wherever I can. For the sake of the bench mock-up, I'm just going to show two cut edges together. So on top of the dimple mat, if I can, I'm overlapping the joints between the foam and the dimple mat as much as I can, just to make sure that we're getting staggered joints. I'm going to butt up my insulation or use the tongue and groove, and then I'm going to seal with our Tyvek house wrap tape all the way around all the joints. So now when we're building our foam insulation on the floor, a couple important points to remember. Like I mentioned previously in a video, we want to make sure that we have a little bit of a gap all the way along the wall. So I'm leaving at least an 1/8 inch to a 1/4 gap between the insulation. This just allows for some expansion and to make sure we're not having the floor foam rub up against the wall foam. It can result in things like some squeaking or noise or other things, so just a little bit of clearance is good. Also, putting a bead of the GE silicone 2 caulk between the wall foam and the dimple mat. So all the way along the floor, I've caulked in between there before I laid down my foam as well. For the subfloor, I'm using a product called Advantech. Advantech is specifically made as a subflooring product. It's not just a particle board. It is a particle board that is impregnated with a resin or a treatment that makes it more water resistant. In fact, if you notice, it comes with a limited lifetime warranty. You can find more information about it at their website. I'll put a link down in the bottom. I'm not going to claim to know exactly what the details of their warranty and so on here, but generally this product is suitable, for example, for contractors sitting outside in the elements for up to 30 days without absorbing and deforming the wood. So it's a product that is meant to be used as a subfloor that may even potentially see some moisture at some point and be able to resist that moisture. Again, we're in a basement. We're providing a vapor and a damp proofing layer underneath with insulation. There is still the potential, though, that if you ever had a flooding insulation or otherwise, this wood could potentially get a little wet. So this is going to be a more suitable material for a basement subfloor material, which is why I'm using the Advantech. Paying a little bit more, but again, I really like this product. Now we're ready to lay down our subfloor. Again, we're going to put the board right in line, or generally in line, with our layer of insulation. Again, with at least an 1/8 inch or 1/4 inch of gap all the way along the wall. When you do this, you should be measuring your wall, and you're going to have some waviness or potential distortion to the wall because of the way the concrete was formed. So you're going to want to look and see where your high points are in the wall and make sure that your gap is all the way along. So we put our first boards down, use the tug and grooving connection wherever we can. Where we have a cut end joint, we're going to leave a little bit of a gap. Manufacturer's recommendation is an 1/8 inch, and that's for additional expansion purposes, thermal expansion purposes. Also to make sure, like the foam, you don't have cut ends rubbing up against each other with any movement in the floor, causing squeaking or noises or that kind of thing as well. For all of the joints, including tongue and groove joints, so if we've got some tongue and groove connections there, and we've got our butt end, what I did is I used these framing straps just to provide a little extra stiffness to the construction. So laid down and tacked in framing straps across the joints here, also across the tongue and groove joints in this way as well. So the reason I did that is, again, the floor is floating. There is going to be some expansion of the materials with changes in temperatures and seasons and so on, changes in temperatures of our concrete floor and the walls. This is just going to provide another mechanism to help hold everything together. It will actually stiffen it up, maybe even prevent or restrict a little bit of that expansion and contraction, but it's not going to be to the point that it's going to be detrimental to our construction. You can see here an example of just how I did that here. So here we've got our subfloor. As we were laying this down, I've got a good joint where the tongue and groove joint is. Used a small bead of subfloor adhesive in the tongue and groove just to get it a little extra protection. Joint strength, I should say. And over here, where we have the 1/8 inch gap between the boards for expansions, if you noticed, I used some of this framing strapping, some small pieces here, and it's just tacked in place, and it actually has a pretty low profile. I've got a rolling chair, it goes right over it pretty smoothly. We're going to end up carpeting over this floor, so after the pad and the carpet, you're really never going to feel these. The reason I use these is there is a little bit, because it's a floating floor, and I'll explain that more in a minute, but when you walk on this, there is a little bit of give and play when you're stepping on one board from another, and this is just a way to kind of keep them tied together a little bit better. My first video when I was talking about the floor construction, and I mentioned that I was laying out the floor here and that I had set it down, and there might have been a little bit of a bow to some of the boards, a little bit of movement from crossing over from one board onto the next board. After letting it sit, probably about, as I was working on this project, the course of about a couple weeks or so, and everything kind of acclimated and settled out real nice, all of that bow, any kind of movement has really seemed to go away, and I've been really happy with the way the floor had settled out. This is what our floating subfloor looks like now. And what you're seeing here actually is because this is the end of my subfloor. This is where my finished basement space is going to turn into my unfinished working area in another part of the basement. What you see here is the dimple mat underneath. You can see the foam board and eventually my subfloor on top of it. Here I ran a bead of the GE silicone caulk to give it a nice seal here as well. My hot water tank ends up having to be just over here. If I ever have a leak in a water tank, condensation from my air conditioning system or the coil, anything running down on the floor. It's going to keep the water away from here, but underneath this dimple mat and away from getting in between this space here. So probably a little bit of overkill on my part, but trying to do the best job that I can. You can see the caulking that I did between the wall insulation and the dimple mat. And you can also see the space that I left between the wall insulation and the floor construction. Over here you can see how the floor, and it's gapped away from the wall at least about 1/8 inch all the way around. The wall is not perfectly straight because it's poured concrete, so it does wave a little bit. So first took some measurements and made sure that I had the right minimum gap all the way around, and started setting my floor from there and making sure it was square as I went. Also, when we were laying down the subfloor, you notice we had to work around these support posts. So we had to cut out some gaps in here that would allow us to be able to fit the subfloor in around these posts. In doing this, I tried to lay it out to make sure that where my gap was, and I'd have that kind of difference in the floor, that it was going to be on the tongue and groove side. So these two pieces stay relatively well connected here. And then we filled it back in with a piece that I cut. You notice that right now I've got it, it's kind of loose. A little bit of joint compound here, but a little bit loose here. I'm not worried about it because the way I also did this in a way to make sure that I'm going to have a wall going across here. And once that wall is built on top of the floor, that's going to keep that down nice and tight. It gives me a nice surface. The floor I did not screw down or lag down to the concrete. You'll see a lot of others who, if they're putting on a subfloor, they're using tap cons or other things and actually fastening that floor down into the concrete. The reason I didn't do that is we've spent a lot of time, energy, and money in trying to really give a good damp and vapor proofing to our foundation, from around our foundation and the flooring. And if I start drilling through that right now, I'm basically compromising the barriers that I've created. If I use tap cons, I'd be puncturing through not only the insulation but also through the vapor barrier dimple matting, and any moisture that's on the floor, water that may be under there can then wick up, and you're basically broken your vapor barrier, so you can get the moisture coming up through as vapor. But now I've got my bottom plate right in line along that chalk line, so that I know it's in the right position. And I'm just going to give it one more check, and then I'm going to screw that to the floor. Again, we're building our walls on top of the floating subfloor, and I don't want to penetrate through the vapor barriers and really not penetrate through the insulation. So I'm using 2.5 inch deck screws, and that's going to get me through the 1.5 inch of the plate, and then it's basically about just shy of 1 inch thickness on the subfloor. So that screw is going to give me bite all the way through the subfloor and just a little bit more, but it's going to be able to hold that plate really well up into the subfloor. That's the second video. Next video we're going to get into the framing, and you see I've already started some of that work here. I'm going to continue on with some of that, and I'll try to walk you through how I went about the framing, connections to the floor, up into the upper floor joists, and go around from there. Thank you very much. Appreciate all your comments. Please leave some below, and appreciate it if you like the page. Thanks, everybody.